Welcome to another Trench Chat, and I'm really pleased to be joined once more by author and historian Richard Van Emden. It's great to have Richard back on the podcast. He's written over 20 books on the Great War now, pioneered the oral history of the Great War, interviewed hundreds of First World War veterans. One of his best-known books is about the last fighting Tommy, Harry Patch, who Richard managed to get back over to the battlefields in those final years of his life. And Richard as well has appeared on so many documentaries about the First World War as well. So Richard is a fantastic historian, brilliant writer, and an all-round good egg. And it's always a pleasure to have him here. So thanks, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about a book and your new book, which is about the volunteers of the Great War. But I just kind of thought this episode will be going out in early November in the kind of lead up to Armistice Day. I don't know about you, but I kind of always find myself at this time of year thinking about the veterans. Is that something that you kind of find yourself doing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always say, I think the back of the book always said I met 270 veterans, but I'm sure with you too, you have your favorites, you have the ones that you recall particularly, and I sort of have a kind of top five that I always think about over the armistice period. The friends, the mates that they lost, obviously as well. But yeah, it's always this time of year that I'm sort of drawn back to them.
And when you think that we're coming up to the 110th anniversary of the Great War next year, a decade on from the centenary, kind of often wonder what they would make of it all now, really.
Oh my God, I don't want to think about it. I think, yeah. I mean, my mother died 4 years ago. I wondered what she'd make of the world now. So herself. So what these guys would make of it, I don't know. I just don't think. But yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of positives as well. Things that they've seen that have changed that they would like. But yeah, I think they would struggle with a lot of what's going on today.
But in terms of the interest in the Great War, I'd like to think that they might be pleased that people are still remembering it. I mean, you've just come back from the Great War Group conference where there was a kind of good attendance there from what I could gather. And, First World War is still actively discussed on social media. So it's not going away.
It isn't going away, and I was with the Great War Group. I was very pleased to see a lot of new people, quite a diverse group, really, and that was really pleasing to see. I think this idea of them moving around the country has worked quite well, and they get their sort of stalwarts who will turn up, and then there'll also be local people who probably wouldn't travel from one end of the country to the other, but if it's in their city, they'll come along, and I think it's a really good way of expanding interest in the Great War.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, kind of after the centenary, perhaps we thought it would all fade away, but to see new groups emerging and people still engaged with it is good news for all of us.
Yes, I hope so. I mean, it's my passion. I did wonder about moving on to World War II, and then thought very long and hard about it. I thought, no, I'm World War One all the way. So for me, new interest in the Great War is to be very much welcomed.
Which brings us on to your new book. I think you were saying it's your 22nd book on the First World War, and in this book you're going to look at volunteers. Now, I think most people, as soon as we say that, will immediately think of Kitchener's Army, but you're looking at a slightly wider brief, I think.
Yes, I mean, I could have kept it to Kitchener's Army, but there are so many magnificent stories from men who just ended up in in territorial units. So I wanted just to basically encompass everybody, to say, look, all those who joined up for whatever reason into whatever unit they wish to enlist. I wanted to bring them all into the fold. So rather than just saying, right, I'm going to focus on the Grimsby Chums and the whole commercials, I want to just do everybody who was interested in enlisting in 1914 and 1950.
And that's one of the incredible things about the British Army of that period, that early Great War period. It was an all-volunteer army, from regulars to territorials to the new army.
Yes, I mean, these were individuals from all walks of life who wanted to offer themselves to their country. And it's such a different time. I mean, they say, the past is another country, and it really is. And this is why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to sort of, look at who were these men who volunteered, what motivated them. And, how did they sort of feel about one another? So it's very much the human story, you're a million men volunteering for Christmas 1914. They're all being thrown into this huge melting pot. How on earth did they get on? How did they see one another? And what did the army think of them? They were going to have to sort of forge these million men into some sort of cohesive fighting force. So I was looking at it from sort of both ends, really, but always trying to stay to the sort of the human side and to look at such key issues as humour and the world in which they lived, the sort of bell tents that they lived in, the billets that they moved into, the training that they undertook across moors. I mean, just trying to encompass as much as I possibly could, always looking at it through their eyes.
And you mentioned kind of how they looked at each other. Did you find a kind of a pecking order, really? Did the regular army look down on the territorials and the territorials look down on the new army?
Oh, of course, yes. I mean, you read that in war diaries, people making quite scathing remarks when the new army turn up in France. You know, it doesn't really matter, the territorial regular. There was a lot of that sort of jealousy and between them. But yeah, I mean, it was just a most extraordinary period of history. And I actually started the book because I always try to think, well, how am I going to sort of get into this? And I started the book after the introduction with a chapter on a friend of mine called Vic Cole, who was in the 7th Royal West Kent Regiment. And what I wanted to do was just do a chapter on what I called it Kitchener's firstborn. And he joined up within 3-4 weeks of the start of war. And I wanted to get into who he was, what motivated him. You know, not because he represented everybody who joined up, but he was so typical of his type. You know, South London boy, brought up in this world of patriotism where duty was fostered at school. He would go up to the sort of Crystal Palace and watch the military displays up there. Everything that he grew up in with sort of forged him into the character that he was and to the person who then, you know, immediately on war breaking out was looking to enlist. So as I say, I always like to look at slightly different things, different ways of getting into the book, and it was through Vic that I went.
So you've kind of drawn on quite a lot of different sources then for this, the kind of veterans that you interviewed, I guess diaries and letters and military records.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I wanted to this time. In the past, I've tended to sort of say, well, you know, if somebody's got a great story, fine, that goes in, and that's true to an extent here as well. But what I wanted to do was to focus on particular individuals. So, like Vic Cole, another chap called Sidney Fuller, Richard Hawkins. It's just to sort of try and follow their story all the way through. So it wasn't just going, well, here's Vic, he's joined up, he talks about what it's like to enlist. Right, we don't hear from him again. Here's another guy. He's going to talk about how rancid the food was in the first week or two, you know, whatever. No, I wanted to say there are people who come in and out and just have sort of small cameos, but I wanted to follow, you know, basically half a dozen characters, maybe slightly more, maybe 7 or 8, right through to going as far as I could take them to going to France, so that we kind of follow their progression as well and see it from the early days right through to the moment they embarked for overseas service.
And I guess that's the kind of beauty of studying individuals, is that they are an individual story, but in many respects they speak for a kind of wider truth.
Yes, I mean, you know, if you picked 6 or 7 characters who've all got very different backgrounds, then you have you know, just even within that very small group cohort, you have a fantastic array of stories. So, you know, I've got 1 or 2 directly from their memoirs. There's a man called Thomas Lyon, who was in the Highland Light Infantry, who he's not well known at all, but he produced a brilliant memoir just talking about those early days and the humor. Oh, he's absolutely brilliant. He's one of those authors you think, you know, he's out of, I don't even know when he died, but, you know, book long out of copyright, long never to be seen again. And but if you can bring him back into the fold and use a lot of his material, which I have, it really works a treat.
And the characters that you chose, did you pick them because they had different backgrounds, or was it different units?
Oh, different backgrounds and different ages. Just to sort of create a sort of melting pot of individuals. So one of them, William Andrews, he's very well known. He was in the Black Watch, and his story of being a journalist joins this Highland regiment. He's from, I think he's from Yorkshire. And he's a very interesting character because he brings out sort of stories which you don't think about. So there he is. He enlisted a group of men who were automatically suspicious of this English-speaking sort of Sassenach, who's obviously well educated. And so by bringing in people like that, you bring in certain aspects to the story which otherwise you'd miss out. So he has this sort of, this sense of when he first enlists and talking about the people he's joined up with, but also feeling entirely out of place and feeling quite lonely for quite a period of time until some other people from his journalistic world sort of enlist as well. And at some point, he actually has this brilliant story of being sort of part. This officer calls him in and speaks to him and says, "Oh, who are you? What are you doing here?" And he's saying, "Are you accusing me of something, sir?" And he's saying, "No, I'm not accusing you, but it's the men are sort of talking." And so by having different individuals like that with different backstories, it just means that they tell a very different story. They lead me down the path I want to get. That they take me. It's not like I'm saying, "Well, I need you to talk about this." So often it's about them leading me down certain avenues which are fascinating, and that was just one that happened to be one.
And with men who were volunteers, did you find a kind of a commonality in the way that they kind of perhaps identified themselves or saw themselves in the kind of wider picture of the army and the war?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, I guess, did they see themselves slightly apart? Really, I guess I guess a regular would say to themselves that they'd chosen to join a regular force. They were highly trained. A territorial he's a part-time Saturday night soldier. All those kind of phrases. And then the new army boys come along and they're turning up in their own socks and trousers, and it's kind of very different army. But did the various reasons why they became volunteers, do you think it kind of made them feel slightly different about themselves as soldiers? Were they citizens first or still soldiers?
Well, I think that, I don't really touch on the regular army as such. It's mostly the territorials and the Kitchener men that I look at. And they very much see themselves as civilians when they enlist. They haven't got a clue what's going on. And that's part of the fun of the story. Some of the humor where you can just feel the awkwardness of the situation. They speak to officers as if they're mates, especially obviously those battalions which have been drawn from a very local area. There's so many of them, Barnsley Pals or whatever. They kind of knew each other as mates, as comrades in football teams, and going to church on a Sunday. So they were very, very at ease with one another. And so they saw themselves as civilians, and it took a lot for the army to basically knock that out of them. There's a brilliant quote from one man called Cuddyford, who talks about first time they go on parade, and I think it's the Scots Guards. So this is not a regular Kitchener battalion. He's in the Scots Guards, and this corporal comes up and he's getting them into line. And Cuddyford just says, "I've got to wander off." And this man just says, "What the hell are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I thought before we sort of get going, I'd go and get a packet of cigarettes from the canteen, if that's all right." And you realise that, just think, oh my God, he doesn't say what happened to him. I can't believe he wasn't feasted for the next 2 hours. But that's what I love. They really were civilians in their mindset. As you say, they turned up in their sort of, spats or their trilbys or their many of them in the most appallingly sort of ripped clothes and looking absolutely disheveled. They were all there. And I love the way. I just love the way that the army tried to kind of get to grips with them. And you've got people just sort of walking on, going, "Well, okay, I'm going to." Like Vic Cole said, literally they were just right. First 20, you are A platoon. Till more men came in. Right, you next 20, you'll be B platoon, or number 2 platoon, and they were just sort of watched in a kind of completely, how do we deal with these people? How are we going to cope with them? And likewise, they looked back and sort of said, "What do we do now?" And so people were made, sort of lance corporals or corporals on the merest things. You're wearing a boater, right? You can be a lance corporal. Who was in the Scouts? I was, sir. Right, you're in the Scouts. And even Vic Cole says, he becomes a lance corporal simply because he knows Morse, for no other reason whatsoever. And there he is as a 17-year-old, surrounded by men who are old enough to be his father. And he says, I feel very awkward, and they make it fairly clear that they don't really respect me, at least not at the start. And so it's a most fascinating period of history, because you do have all these people from all walks of life all melding together, and the army desperately trying to sort something out. It's hysterical. And then, of course, there they are. They're sent to from the depot to some camp somewhere, and with all these bell tents sitting there. They're pushed into these tents, and it's another little microcosm. What's that world going to be like for all those men who suddenly get into a bell tent and barely know each other, and then have to share something which is for 12 men suddenly has 16 in there. And the stories you get are absolutely hysterical. And again, just go back to Vic Cole. He said it was so funny because when we got in there, it was all, oh, excuse me, oh, pardon me, oh, I trod on your toe, And he said that very quickly fell apart as people started to get annoyed and aggravated with one another. So it's just that world that I absolutely love. And something which I just felt, there are brilliant books like Peter Simpkins' book on Kitchener's Army and Charles Messenger's. And I thought, I don't want to go down that avenue because they're brilliant books. I don't want to replicate them. I want to get into the sort of minutiae of what it was like to be a Kitchener's recruit in 1914. And the stories are hysterical. I mean, I could read you. I've got loads of them here. There was one here, again, Thomas Lyon, actually. Just to give you one particular quote, he says, a rugby scrum isn't nearly so excited as the mere effort to buckle on one's kilt in a tent in which there are 11 other men engaged in the same operation, and simply to comb one's hair calls for as much courage as is required to face a band of penny dreadful Indians, for one is liable to be scalped at any moment. Such a jostling and scrambling and pushing and shoving and bumping can hardly be conceived, much less described. The air resounds with beg pardon, sorry old chum, you clumsy idiot, and what the blankety blank are you playing at? And I just love that, because what happens in a bell tent is never described anywhere else. No one ever talks about it. And yet there is that little world there, which is fascinating.
It must have been a big kind of culture shock to people. I mean, I interviewed a guy who was in the Royal Sussex Regiment, and he kept quite a detailed diary, as did his brother, who died in 1918. And they were from a middle-class Hove family, and they had big problems in being naked in front of people. The army suddenly requires them to strip everything off. Even standing in front of the medical officer having a kind of, an inspection while they're enlisting was a bit of a challenge. So the whole world really by enlisting was turned upside down, I guess.
It was, and I mean, it's very interesting that the bell tent world, because it is a microcosm of the wider world in which they're existing, and the whole sort of mathematics of dealing with a limited area with men who have got all their belongings with them and all sort of trying to be nice and polite. And then very quickly, those suss out that you want to be at the back of the tent, because in the middle of the night, you're not going to be trampled over by somebody who wants to go to the urinal. And you've got people like George Coppard, who you remember him, he's 16 years old, shoved to the edge of the tent, wakes up in the middle of the night because some guy's trampling across to try and go for a wee. He then sprays it everywhere, and he's kind of covered in urine. And he says there's an upside to being near the tent flap, because the stink in the tent is so awful. You want to be near where the fresh air is, but equally you're going to get sprayed 2 or 3 times at night. So I just love that world, because it says so much about the individuals, and it tells you so much about how they, as you say, they had to get on. They had to find a way of becoming, comrades and people who would, put their lives on the line for one another. And there's a great story, in fact, one guy who remembers a really weedy 16-year-old, he thinks he's about 16, puts his hand up to be a lance corporal, and they just look at him and just go, good God, we wouldn't follow him to the canteen, never mind to the trenches. And he says it's amazing, because over time, he really shows that he's got incredible steadfastness, courage. You know, he looks after the men under his command. He's only a lance corporal, and so he really wins their respect, and that could cut both ways in the army. You know, you could either lose all respect, and there are plenty of cases where people basically set out to make you look an idiot, as or people like this that won the respect of their peers, and that's all part of that kind of process of molding it all together.
And I guess with a citizen army, I mean, we kind of think of them all. I mean, there's that much overused phrase "heroes" when we describe the soldiers of any conflict, but these are men, and they're ordinary men, and they might like each other, but they also might fall out under these circumstances. I guess there was some quite trying situations occasionally.
Oh yes, I mean they're punch-ups galore. I mean they really are. They didn't muck around, and of course, you know, there were men from hard guys who came up from the mines of the steelworks, who didn't take any nonsense. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you read memoirs, and they rarely describe much more than the fact that two people have sort of leathered each other for a couple of minutes. They don't really go into much more description than that. But it's going on quite a lot as the pecking orders are sorted out, as people, you know, lose that kind of immediate sort of civil genteel nature that they had, now that they're sort of starting to get annoyed. And of course, you know, as things deteriorate, as food becomes inconsistent, or is never really that consistent, or the quality of it, or the fight over it becomes more intensive. So people are shown for what they are. And very often you read, particularly of the younger soldiers, you know, the lads who are 16, 17, really fighting to try and get any food whatsoever. You know, when the sort of gunfire tea is served up, you know, these guys all kind of pounce, and there's very little left for them. And they complain. I mean, there's one lad who complains. He says, "Look, you know, if anybody should get food and sustenance, it's us, because we're growing. We're 16 years old. We're still growing. These guys who are, you know, 24, 25 are fully grown. They don't need it." But of course, you know, no one's going to think like that. They're just going to go, "I want what I could possibly get." So yes, I mean, all those sort of fractious moments that you see, especially over things that matter to men, when they're a bit tired, a bit fed up, like food, is a real eye opener.
And do you think that the kind of training that they went through was fairly rudimentary? A lot of it was kind of physical related, marching and all that kind of stuff. Do you think that really began to prepare them for what lay ahead? And do they kind of remark on that?
Well, it doesn't prepare them. I mean, clearly, you know, doing endless what's called Swedish drill is not going to prepare you to face a German with a bayonet coming over the top. So, but they are pretty. A lot of them are pretty weedy individuals. You know, there's a brilliant quote here. I wonder if I can find it, from a medical officer. Yeah, here we are. A man called Lieutenant Martin. I'll just read you what he says. He said, "We had all sorts of derelicts turn up. One weary-looking veteran, unwashed and with straw sticking in his hair, indicative of a bed in a haystack the previous night, was blind in one eye and very lame. A draper's assistant from a London shop had a twisted spine. An old soldier had syphilitic ulcers on his legs. Some had bad hearts from excessive smoking, etc., etc." Then he says, "The occupations of the recruits were as diverse as their shapes and constructions. A runaway sailor, a cockney coster, a draper's assistant, a sea cook, a medical student, a broken down parson, an obvious jailbird, and a Sunday school teacher." So all these people, you know, including those who are underage, of which there were legions, they were often in a fairly poor state, a perilous state of health, and they needed to be forged into a fighting unit. And you could only do that to begin with by things like Swedish drill, this kind of, you know, press ups, you know, chin up, all these sort of pushing your arms out endlessly, so that you would get some sort of modicum of fitness. And very often my interest has always been with the underage soldiers, the boy soldiers, and a lot of them were allowed to enlist because they were in such poor shape that the recruiting sergeant thought, well, they're probably never going to see active service overseas, but they're actually, you know, 31-inch chest, 6 stone, 11 pounds. Well, this is going to do them a whole heap of good. It's going to give them 3 square meals a day if they can get it. It will, they'll be marching around for 10, 15 miles a day. It's going to do them the world of good. So so that initial training they had to undergo was crucial to create the substance which we were then going to teach bayonet fighting, bombing, musketry, things like that. But that all had to come first. And it's very interesting when you look at, there's one particular soldier I recall, and I just monitored when he got things. So, there's hardly anything to go around. They some people maybe got a khaki tunic, and somebody else has got some putties or something like that. But I just watched how long it took for the army, actually, through the difficulties of supply anyway, but also just how long it took him to get the full kit, because it wasn't really necessary. For months on end, he really just needed to do physical training. He didn't need, all the equipment that he would take to France. And indeed, he joins up in early September 14. And the last of his belongings he will need for overseas service doesn't arrive until, I think, something like May 1915. That's when he's got pretty much anything. And then he's about to go overseas anyway. So for a long, long time, they don't need this stuff. They just need to get fit. And that's what they do, endless marching. And, they love it and they hate it, as all soldiers do. I've got a relative in the army, and he's always said, the worst thing is a 25-mile route march, but at the end of it, you feel great, but at the end of it, you feel exhilarated. But while you're doing it, you hate it. And that's so true of now as it was back then.
And I guess they gradually emerge as soldiers. I mean, I know photographs are a very big part of the research that you do and your books as well, particularly, previously unpublished photographs. And I've seen myself in kind of contemporary images of volunteers, whether it's territorials or Kitchener's men. They kind of look kind of ramshackle soldiers in those early photos, but by the eve of active service, they do actually look part of a proper military force.
Oh, they do. Yeah, they look fantastic actually just before they go overseas. But I've got about 200 photographs, unseen photographs. I think they're almost all unseen, maybe one or two not, but most of them are. And you can see them changing. You can see them, they're there in all their when they first get their khaki, it's all kind of misshapen and they're all lumpy and it looks terrible on them. And then you gradually watch them as things improve. The photographs are so revealing. I'll admit to something. If you whenever something sounds a bit too technical, it's not from me. It's from Taff Gilligan, my great mate. So I'll call him up and I'll go, "What the hell rifle is he carrying?" And he'll say, "Oh, that's a Japanese. What's it? Aris. What were they called? Aris, short carbine." I'm like, I would never have known that in a million years. Thanks, Taff. And that goes into the picture capture. But it's great because he really did help me, because there were certain pictures where I look at it and go, that's a great photograph, but I really can't tell you much about it other than what I can basically see. And every now and again, I'd ring him up, go, Taff, what's this? And they'd say, okay, that's what that is. And there's a brilliant one, a really great chapter opener of some men of the South Wales Borderers when they were building huts. And I didn't know when this picture was taken. And I sent it over to Taff and I said, "Oh, this is a fantastic photograph. I want to use it as a double-page spread." And he said, "That's a really interesting, that will be the autumn of 1914. I went, "Right, great. How do you know?" He said, "Because they stopped using corrugated iron at the back end of 1914 because they needed it for the war effort." I said, "Really?" He said, yeah, that's why. And they're all these men, these Bol men, are all sat on a huge heap of corrugated iron with all the huts being made in the background. And he was just suddenly he was able to date a photograph, which I was kind of, I don't know, could be late 14, could be spring of 1915. I have no idea. So so there's some really, really great photographs, and I have to sort of thank him as well for improving them sometimes just by what you can see in the image.
Well, if anyone knows about huts, it's going to be Taff, isn't it?
Exactly, yes.
And once they kind of head off onto active service, do you see the kind of change in the way they begin to describe how they see their service and how they experience the reality of the front?
Yeah, I mean, they don't go in my book. They don't go to France. I mean, they go to France, obviously, but they don't ever reach France in my book. They literally embark and they watch England slide into the distance. They go down Southampton Water, or they leave Dover and watch the white cliffs recede. And it's their sort of thoughts about, well, this is it. This is where we're going. So that's where I take the book. I don't take it any further than that. But what's interesting in the months before that is the sense of frustration that you get. A lot of these guys genuinely thought that there wasn't, the time between them enlisting and getting to France was going to be really, really short. They had no idea it'd taken them a year, the best part of a year for many of them more than a year. And so you start seeing that kind of, when are we going? I'm sick of marching. I'm sick of doing all this repetitive stuff. I want to go. And so that's what you see in the second half of the book, is that sense of, we want to now put into action what we've learned. We want to actually show the Germans what we can do. But at the same time, as they get closer, and then of course, things like sort of embarkation leave is awarded and things like that, you get the kind of sense of, okay, this is it now. This is serious now. This is what we're going to do. And those sort of last days with family, and that sort of the growing tension as well as the excitement. It's a very moving time. And then with the photographs that go with those, I've got one picture of men of the First Fourth Royal Scots on leaving Liverpool off to Gallipoli, as it turned out. And the commanding officer said half of these men never came back. And you look at the photograph of them. They're probably they're halfway. In fact, they're stripped off in a kind of paddling pool that's been built onto the ship. And you look at them, and they're full of vim and vigor, look fit, look ready, and you go, God, wow, a lot of these guys did not make it. And then it becomes very poignant, along with the kind of excitement and the enthusiasm and the willingness to go. They want to go. They don't want to hang around anymore. So that's very much the sort of second half of the story.
And I guess a modern audience would sometimes find it difficult to understand that. We kind of think of the First World War as this dreadful experience, because it was, it was not always a good experience, but they perhaps kind of find it difficult to understand that men were not just ready to go, but they really, really wanted to be there and didn't want to be left out of it. They
did. I mean, it would surprise a lot of people. I mean, of course, they didn't really understand what they were going into, especially those like Harry Patrick came later, knew full well his brother had been wounded, come home and told him all about it. But for these lads, they didn't really understand what they were going into. And so there is a sort of naivety there. But a lot of them, I remember one veteran saying to me, he went to Gallipoli, and he said, you cannot understand the patriotism that we grew up with, the willingness to give ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that's true of everybody. And he said it wasn't duty, it was D-U-T-Y. He spelt it out for me, and he said, that's what we live for. That's what we wanted to do our duty by our country. And it's, it's it was so naive for so many of them, and it ended up in death and squalor. But it's a fascinating insight into that generation, which has just endlessly fascinated me. And I think it's kind of what gives it, I guess, the different dimensions, because, kind of, if we look at some popular kind of depictions of the British Army in the First World War, it's kind of, lions led by donkeys and all that kind of stuff, but which has been debunked many times by more recent historians. But I think some people are surprised that I guess the men of the First World War do have this kind of depth, that perhaps, having seen them as older men, like Harry Patch kind of fading away, there was a sense that they were just, went straight from being a young soldier in a horrific war to being an old man, and there wasn't the kind of same depths to them as there were to modern people. But like you said, the past is a foreign country. People forget this, maybe. Yes, yeah, and I get, one of the reasons why I wanted to cut down the number of people in the book was because I wanted people to appreciate them as individuals, and not just to kind of rent a quote, that you followed their story. And it didn't always work. I mean, I've got a quote at the end from Alan Thomas when he talks about a young man. He only, again, it's a kind of cameo moment, because it was a story that needed to be told, but he only appears at that moment. And he talks about a young lad called Mitchell who taught. It's very moving because he says, I've never left, I don't know, Beckenham or wherever he comes from. I've never left that area. I've never been abroad. I've never done anything. And, I'm obviously willing to go, but I'm not happy to go. And he kept talking, and Thomas keeps saying, he keeps referring to where he comes from and his, that connection with home. And he just doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to go. And he's killed, and he says he was killed relatively quickly. And there's a great poignancy in those sort of stories, which are, which I hopefully I bring out at the back end of the book. So what I wanted to do was to have I think Richard Holmes said this after he wrote Tommy. He said, "I'm sick of the death and the carnage. I'm sick of writing about people being blasted to pieces or bayoneted." And I kind of I feel a certain sympathy with that, because there are, especially with what's going on in the world at the moment as well, I do get really tired of endless repetitions of bombing and bayoneting and killing. And I kind of, with this book, I thought this is so refreshing, because what I'm doing is I'm taking them up to the moment of landing, but right up to that point, it's encapsulating the world, which isn't full of the odd fight and whatever, as I've said, but encapsulating a world where it's just a kind of humour and a comradeship and a willingness to do their duty, and there's no death, there's no killing, there's no violence really, and I really appreciated that in this book. I was quite glad. It felt as I say, refreshing to do something like that, where no one dies, unless where there's a couple of guys who sadly die in training, but essentially they are intact right up until the end of the book, which I love.
And do you think some of these guys kind of look back on that period from enlistment through to training before they went on active service as kind of a golden age, a golden period of their time in the Great War?
Ooh, some of them, well, as with all veterans, they tell you lots of different things. So I met veterans who said, "I wish I'd never gone. I hated every minute." Jack Davis said, "I was depressed every single day I was in France. I didn't want to, once I realized what I'd got myself into, and I was there until I either died, got wounded, or somehow managed to contrive to survive the entire war." He said, "I was full of depression." I met other people who said, "I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I'm so glad it made a man out of me, whatever that is." It gave me, a sense of perspective. It gave me a sense of, Norman Collins said to me, the officer in the Seaforth Highlanders, he lived to be 101. He said to me, I came back going, how can I be a failure in my life when all my mates, and he really did lose a heck of a lot of friends, all my friends are dead. I've been given this chance. If I come back and just go, woe is me, and do nothing, then I'm paying no tribute to my comrades whatsoever. So it really did split. There were a lot who wish they'd never gone. There were those who wish they'd never gone, but had gone and sort of said, well, okay, I took it for what it was, and I forged a life from that. And there were those who said, I not loved every minute, but I kind of enjoyed the war. There were those sort of people who came back and said, really, I've grown from this. And equally, there were also people who came back who for the end of the war was the most extraordinary moment in their lives, and they never moved on from that. Then they got stuck. I can't remember, there's a VC like that, isn't there, who his family just said he lived for the war and he loved the war. And when he came back, he was useless at anything else but killing, which is a terrible thing to say, but that's what the family said of him.
Yeah, there's a few of them. Arthur Pollard, VC, he talks about a fire eater, the great fire eater. He kind of says he's never happier than when he was in no man's land with a Lee Enfield rifle in his hands, hunting the Germans. What do men like that do when the war's over? It's kind of
Well, people like Adrian Carter de Weert as well. I went to a portrait gallery the other day and I saw his picture that he's painting. I went, oh well, look at that. And I told my friends who I was with, I said, well, my son is named partially after a man who went into the army with this guy. And he always said, he was just the personification of courage. and he seemed to have no fear whatsoever at any time. But he was also such a tough character. I remember the way it says he never trusted himself to take grenades into the trenches because he was never sure he wouldn't throw them at his own men if they weren't performing as he wanted. Just bizarre. And he got wounded. What did he get wounded? About 12 times throughout his military service. But love that life, like Pollard, just seemed to just grow into it. And Richard Hawkins, I don't know if you've met Richard, that amazing guy. He said his commanding officer said, not his brigade commander turned to Hawkins' commanding officer and said, "Good God, I don't think you're enjoying this, Carr." And Carr said, "No, sir, I hate every minute of it." He said, "Do you? I just can't get enough of it, And these people fascinate me, absolutely fascinate me. But you get, they are the antithesis of the people who just said, "God, I wish I'd never been forced to go. I've never been able to recover." And that's, of course, another story.
I guess these are all part of the kind of myriad faces and voices of the Great War. Have you any particular favourite kind of accounts or quotes that you found during the course of your research?
Oh gosh. Well, there were things that I was quite interested by, things that I didn't realise. There was one particular quote by Sidney Fuller, whose memoirs at the IWM, and he talked about basically wanting to join the Royal Garrison Artillery, and he turns up to join up, and the guy says, "You need to go to Bury St Edmunds." And he's saying, "Well, isn't that where the Suffolk Regiment is?" Yeah, you just need to go down there, and they'll sort out. Just tell them you want to join the Royal Garrison Artillery. So he turns up there and he says, "That's the last thing I hear about the Royal Garrison Artillery. I'm in the Suffolk Regiment." I thought, what's happened there? I thought you were, as a volunteer, you could basically pick your unit. And then I remembered we interviewed a man called Reginald Spraggins. And I thought, I wonder what he said. I went back to the interview we did with him about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And lo and behold, he said, he goes up, wants to enlist. He says, "What do you want to do?" So all I want to do is work with horses. I don't care what I go in to work with horses. Right, off to Bury St Edmunds. Tell them you want to go and work with horses. That's the last thing I ever heard about horses. So I realised that I didn't realise that people could be kind of pushed into regiments and say, "Well, we've got enough men in the artillery now. You're all going to go to the Suffolk Regiment." Although you've asked to go into X or Y, regardless of that fact, you're going into the Suffolk. So I just loved it because it was one of those stories I hadn't really thought about before, how people were kind of manipulated into particular units. And to find somebody who would corroborate that story from somebody who's long dead, from somebody I'd interviewed, I really loved that. It was just like, oh my God, yeah. And I rang up Tapp and I said, "Tapp," he goes, "God, that doesn't surprise me whatsoever." So I think part of it was that exploration. What I loved about it wasn't just the wide, I've got so many quotes, so many things that are just hysterical, and a lot of the humour. There's a lot of humour in the book, but it's just the little things that woke me up to aspects of the war that I'd never really thought about. Whether it's trying to put a kilt on in a bell tent, or whether it's trying to get on with people you're billeted with, and that's that whole other story of 800,000 men being billeted on civilians. Just aspects of that I'd never really taken on board, and by sort of delving into all these stories, it just as you'll know, it just enlightens you and brings a new vista to the Great War. And the more you know about the Great War, as you've always said, the more you realise absolutely sweet FA.
It is. You realise it is this titanic subject that is just enormous in every way. And the more you delve into it, the more kind of side tracks you find yourself on, and the deeper and deeper you find yourself in it. And I think that's its fascination, really.
Yeah, which is why I can't leave it alone, and it's why I'm as I said, I've thought about going to the Second World War, and I thought, no, I don't have the capacity at my age to do that anymore. I will always be skating on thin ice if I do that. I would much prefer to carry on with the Great War, because it is endlessly fascinating, and there's always something new that you can learn. Okay, there are aspects of the war which I'm not particularly interested in. As I say, kit and weaponry don't really interest me, but I have a help for that, so that's okay. But everything else, that human condition in times of strife. Wow, just it's endlessly interesting. And the Great War is such a potboiler for that.
Most definitely. So when can we look forward to reading the book, Richard?
It's out. It's going to be basically out in a week. So if I got hang on a minute, I've got this arrived today.
Wow.
So that's the cover. That's the new cover. Actually, I changed the cover at the last possible moment. So if you go on Amazon, it's the original, it's the older cover, but this is the new cover, which was done. As I say, I just suddenly had a change of mind. So we're getting Amazon, who were always a bit slow to change. That's the cover. So it's going to be out. It's basically from, I would say, in the next few days, directly from Pen and Sword. It's in the warehouse now, so I think Jonathan there was just going to tell me when it's available, and I guess from Amazon or bookstores in the next couple of weeks. So very soon.
Brilliant. So we'll put a link to that on the podcast website so people can find it.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I appreciate that.
No, well, thank you for joining us once more. And like you said, there's kind of so many layers to the First World War. I can't believe this is the last time that we'll chat like this about some aspect of the conflict. So thank you, Richard. We're really looking forward to this book and wish you every success with it.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks again, Richard.
Cheers.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.